Aristotle authored one of the most influential texts in the history of literary criticism. His Poetics was probably written in the late 330s BCE at the Lyceum, the university he'd founded in Athens. The Poetics was in two books, one primarily focused on tragedy and the other on comedy. But the book on comedy hasn't survived for us to read today. The Poetics is important for at least three reasons. First, it provided a set of analytical concepts and tools for discussing how tragedy works. These advanced the possibilities of criticism immeasurably in comparison with what was available before Aristotle. Second, after its rediscovery in the Renaissance, it was used as a handbook of practical advice for aspiring dramatists and left a profound mark on the form and content of tragic drama, which lingers today, even though the influence is quite often taking the form of a radical rejection of his tenets. But third, and perhaps most important, it provided a refutation of Plato's objections to art and poetry, and in particular to theatre in his Republic and Ion. It's been an important counterweight to Plato's anti-theatricalism and to all who've opposed theatre and mimetic art subsequently, usually on religious grounds. Before we start asking how Aristotle himself saw the nature and function of tragedy, which will form the bulk of this lecture, there are four contexts we need to sketch. First, the text as we have it, unlike most of Aristotle's treatises, wasn't worked up for oral delivery in fluent style. Its telegraphic prose may even represent little more than notes from which he improvised presentations to his students. And this can be very frustrating. He doesn't expand, for example, on his crucial concept of catharsis, leaving us forced to guess at what precisely he meant. The second context is that he's writing with his great teacher Plato's ideas in mind. His treatise is a response to Plato's repudiation of drama. Aristotle was from northern Greece, but from the age of 17 to 37, he spent 20 whole years studying and working at Plato's academy in Athens, until the older man died in 347. Aristotle only left the academy then because he wasn't elected Plato's successor as its head, despite being by far the most brilliant student. He was probably actually in the lecture hall when Plato ran the seminars, which formed the basis of his Republic. In the final book, Plato's Socrates concludes his case against the poets, but he does throw down a gauntlet, inviting anyone who so desires to write a refutation of his case. He says, "We allow no poetry in our city except hymns to the gods and the praises of good men." But Socrates invites poetry's advocates to plead her cause in prose without metre, show that she's not only delightful, but beneficial to orderly government and to all the life of man. Now, those twin concepts of delightfulness and benefit to the community are fundamental to Aristotle's refutation and to all ancient literary criticism. Delightfulness, or pleasure, is what Greeks called the element of hairdo, related to our word hedonism. In Latin, it's dulce. Bringing benefits, usefulness, utility, they called the element of ophelimon. In Latin, it's utile. Aristotle's theory of tragedy as bringing benefits in a pleasurable way is a direct response to the Platonic challenge. Plato's central objection to drama was that it was harmful to the members of the ideal city-state of his Republic, but his reasons are several, and they're all related to his overall philosophical system. Plato believed that the world our senses perceive isn't the real world, but a mere shadow or copy of a permanent, unchanging world of disembodied, eternal ideas or forms. There are forms of actual material things, so there's the idea of a table in our heads, for example, an idea or concept which must exist in the eternal realm of ideas. There are also forms of abstract ideas like equality or virtue. Our perceptual world is just an inferior copy of this ideal realm. When we do art and paint a picture or write a poem about something in our perceptual world, when we paint a picture of a bed, for example, the artwork is even less valuable than the material bed we sleep in because it's a copy of a copy. The Greek word for a copy is mimesis. This means that from the point of view of acquiring true knowledge about beds, that is, epistemologically, the bed is not only worthless if it's painted, but possibly deceptive, it's fictive. Poetry that represents people doing things in the material world is also inherently fictive and cognitively, epistemologically unable to offer true knowledge. Even worse, Plato adds in Book 10 of the Republic, our senses are inadequate and can be tricked, for example, by optical illusions. Theatrical poetry, which uses scenery painting and acting and first-person dialogue, is the most dangerous of all forms of copying material reality, that is, of mimesis. There is a further epistemological problem with poetry that Plato raises in another dialogue, a much shorter one, called the Ion. Socrates grills a performer of epic poetry, a famous rhapsode called Ion, on what his knowledge of what poetry is and of Homer. While acknowledging that there must be a whole category called poetry, indeed a techne or craft or art or skill of poetry in general, Ion cannot define that whole category. He can't even comment on poets other than Homer. So Socrates proposes that Ion does not possess the poetic art, but is inspired. Socrates also grills him on the extent of his knowledge of the different things that Homer imitates or represents, like chariot driving, medicine, navigation, carpentry, fishing, prophecy, livestock pasturage, textile production, and military generalship. Socrates actually gets Ion to admit that a specialist in any of those areas of knowledge will have superior knowledge to a poet. The implication is that poets like Ion shouldn't speak about areas of knowledge where their knowledge is deficient. But Plato has other objections. He believed in God, but believed that God or the gods were perfect, virtuous, and unchanging. They were nothing like the amoral, often immoral, selfish, self-seeking gods of Greek culture, who transformed themselves into animals, lied, cheated, and wore human disguise. So Plato argued that all art and poetry which represented the gods being immoral or changing identity needed to be excluded from the Republic. And this, if you think about the contents of Greek epic and drama, doesn't leave very much room for saying anything very much about the gods at all. Another problem stems from Plato's model of the human soul. He thought that it was divided into a rational and an irrational part. The rational part is what philosophers cultivate. It involves concentrating on the ideal world of disembodied forms and concepts and relegating to a poor second place the material world we perceive through our senses, as well as all our bodily needs and desires. We need to activate our rational, cerebral components to fight and subdue all our passions and desires and emotions. And in his Phaedrus, Plato uses the image of the rational part of the soul as a charioteer who subdued the horses of passion with whips and bridles until they're totally under his control. But subduing our passions, says Plato, means avoid doing anything that can nurture them or feed them or encourage them in any way. Watching mythical heroes weep, get angry, or behave in any way not self-controlled and ideally masculine makes men less able to control their own emotions and makes them effeminate. We directly see, he says, what we see imitated in art, and it is bad for us. Now, this has a political consequence too. Philosophers know that art is fiction, and philosophers can make themselves immune to the psychological harm which watching heroes behave in that morally weak and effeminate manner can do. But ordinary people can't. ordinary people need to be protected from the harm done by theatre. This means the philosopher kings of the Republic need to act as censors on ordinary people's behalf. When Aristotle came to write his response to Plato's arguments, he used ideas which he'd developed in his turn in his total philosophy. So the third context in which we need to place Aristotle's approach to tragedy is his total system. And this explains some of the features which a modern reader used to literary criticism may find off-putting, especially at the beginning of the treatise, such as his outlining of the genus and species of mimetic art and poetry, his distinction between tragedy's constituent elements. Aristotle rejected Plato's theory of the ideal world of forms outright. He thought we should do intellectual work from the ground upwards rather than imposing a system top-down. We should start with that material world we can perceive, divide up all the entities in our experience, both actual objects or abstract concepts like virtue or tragedy, and we should classify them. We should study them in detail using all our senses, empirical observation, and move from that towards general definitions. In the Poetics, he doesn't address Plato's objection that human senses are unreliable, because he's got faith in our ability to observe. We should ask what constituent parts there are, who makes or does them, out of what, to what design, and for what overall purpose. Now, this empirical systemization explains much that he says early in the treatise about the media of art and poetry. He also believed that things, organic entities like plants and animals, material objects like statues, and immaterial ones like virtue or tragedy, go through a developmental process. An oak tree starts with an acorn and grows until it reaches maturity. It's telos. This is called teleology. A statue starts as a lump of rock and it doesn't achieve its telos until it's a finished work of art in a temple. Tragedy began as improvised prologues to hymns to Dionysus, went through a satydrama phase, and only latterly achieves its telos as the sort of mature tragedy that Aristotle identifies with Sophocles' Oedipus. Aristotle also completely reorganised the way in which people thought about different kinds of intellectual work. It's crucial to Plato's view on poetry and theatre that he discusses them as part of what's a great endeavour in the branch of Greek philosophy called ethics, which also included politics. How should we live and behave, both as individuals and as communities? But Aristotle divides knowledge into three branches of study, or episteme. There's practical knowledge, which analyses how we act. There's theoretical knowledge, which analyses things we contemplate, like nature or the planets. There's productive knowledge, which analyses how we produce or make things like poems or speeches or art and architecture. This is a separate category from ethics and must be approached in a different way. He says this explicitly towards the end of his Poetics, in chapter 25. Correctness in the art of poetry is not the same thing as correctness in the art of politics. And here he at least indirectly refutes Plato's argument that poetry can be judged and indeed banned on ethical and political grounds. For Aristotle, poetry is self-contained, it's a discrete entity, it must be judged as good or bad poetry by poetic yardsticks, not as a component of politics or political ones. Art is an autonomous entity, not a subcategory of the study of behaviour. Moreover, there are people unlike Ion, in Plato's Ion, who can discuss the poetic craft as a whole, which is of course exactly what he's doing in the Poetics. Aristotle elaborates. There are two kinds of mistake a poet can make. The first is a poetic mistake, where the poet isn't good enough at poetry to make a convincing verbal mimesis, imitation, for example, of a horse, which is poetically satisfactory. The mistake might be he used an inappropriate choice of diction or metaphor or rhythm. But the other is an accidental or contingent mistake where the poem is satisfactory poetically, but contains a mistaken conception of something. And Aristotle gives the example of a horse advancing with both its right legs simultaneously, which is actually impossible. The error belongs not to poetry, but to another specialist branch of knowledge, that is, equestrianism. And this point refutes Socrates' attack on Iron's deficient expertise in the arts other than the poetic art. Making a mistake because you don't know much about horses doesn't mean that the poem is bad poetically. Of course, Aristotle concedes, it is better to give a correct picture of the horse if this can be done without sacrificing the poetic excellence of the poem. It is best that there are no errors, either poetic or of any other kind relating to another sphere of knowledge. If something is portrayed that cannot exist, for example, a female stag with horns, then an error has been made. But it's justifiable if the poet thus achieves the object of poetry and makes a part of the poem more striking, ekpliktik koteron, creating more ekplexis. It's less of an error not to note that the female stag has no horns than to make a bad picture that's unrecognisable. If the mimesis of the female deer is effective poetically, the zoological error just isn't important. Aristotle adds here that we can make comments from the ethical sphere when assessing whether something has been done correctly, poetically speaking. So we can discuss whether a good poetic effect has been achieved by the choice of speaker or agent, whether it's done to secure a greater good or avert a greater evil. And this moral assessment is a legitimate part of literary criticism, but it's subordinate to the art of poetry rather than the other way around. Now, this very simple point that the art of poetry is independent, autonomous, and to be judged by its own poetic yardsticks in terms of poetic impact takes much of the force out of Plato's critique of the epistemological and ethical dangers for citizens of watching theatre. Aristotle's system also undermines Plato's psychological model, where Plato thought that emotions and passions were inherently problematic and needed to be subdued by reason. Aristotle thought nothing of the sort. We need, he said, to figure out what's the appropriate role for all the human characteristic vices and virtues, such as courage, self-control, civility, or generosity. For Aristotle, character traits and emotions are almost all acceptable, indeed necessary to a healthy psyche, provided they're present in the right amount. And he calls the right amount the middle or mean amount, the meson. He actually never used the popular term golden mean. Anger, for example, is essential to a healthy personality. Someone who never feels anger is not always going to do the right thing. If your child is bullied at school, you don't get angry, you won't take them to the head teacher's office to ask for something to be done. You are an inadequate moral agent. Yet too much anger is also a shortcoming or a defect. It's a vice. It is always a question of the right amount of the emotion and passion at the right time. Aristotle's views on the validity of the perceptible world as an entity worth study in its own right, and on the permissibility of emotions in the right amount, also have political consequences. Plato thought that the majority of people, the non-philosophers, were quite incapable of protecting themselves against the moral harm done by theatre. They're also incapable of taking anything valuable from it. Aristotle had far more faith in the masses. In the Poetics, he insists that the pleasurable learning that tragedy offers is accessible not only to philosophers, but to all men. So, at this point, let us sum up what we've discovered so far. Aristotle's whole approach neutralises the force of several of Plato's objections, not only to theatre, but to mimetic arts in general. If there is no superior realm of ideas, then poetry is not a fake imitation. Every entity encountered by human beings can and deserves to be studied, and its causes and functions and characteristics analysed. Our senses offer good enough sources of information about what we study. There are also different types of knowledge, and ethical or political inquiry, which is practical, is not even in the same category as poetic skill, which is productive. There is indeed an entity called the poetical art, in which inferences can be drawn about the whole art of poetry. What makes a good poem, what makes a poem good, is different from what makes something politically good. Poetry does not need to be perfect in its transmission of information about other types of knowledge, but aim to be arresting, have an impact on its own terms. Emotions and passions aren't inherently bad things to be suppressed entirely by reason. They needed to be attended to so that they function properly in the right amount. Ordinary people can join in such projects just as much as trained intellectuals, even if they don't acquire exactly the same level of understanding. They do not need to be protected, however, from the mimetic arts by censorship. So, we're now in a position to analyse what Aristotle actually says about tragedy in the Poetics. In his first chapter, he asks what drama's aural media of communication are compared with other genres, identifies them as rhythm, melody, and metre. In chapter 2, he asks what objects are represented in drama and decides that it is people in action doing things, but that comedy aims as representing men as worse than they are and tragedy as better than in actual life. This is a crucial difference from Plato, who criticises the bad moral examples set by characters in both genres of drama. In chapter 3, Aristotle points out that in drama all the characters speak, but there is no third-person narration. Plato has also made this point and said that drama was much more dangerous than narrative poetry because of this. But Aristotle passes no moral comment on it. For him, it's a formal and artistic distinction rather than a moral one. Chapter 4 provides his crucial defence of mimesis as a beneficial phenomenon in human life, where for Plato all mimesis was suspect. For Aristotle, mimesis is natural, pleasurable, and has a learning function. First, he says, the instinct of imitation is implanted in man from childhood, one difference between him and other animals being that he is the most imitative of living creatures, and through imitation learns his earliest lessons. And no less universal is the pleasure felt in things imitated. Then he produces one of his most brilliant arguments. There are objects which give us pain to look at, such as disgusting animals and corpses. But we can look at pictures of them and learn about disgusting animals and death from the pictures. Moreover, that process gives us pleasure. Aristotle's probably referring here to his own sketches and diagrams of creatures, ones that he drew for use in his zoological works, and to all the many artworks that portrayed dead bodies that surrounded ordinary ancient Greeks, including paintings on vases. The pleasure we get is of two kinds. One is the recognition of what the picture depicts, which we can relate to our own real-world perceptions. But the other is purely aesthetic and derives from the execution or colouring of the picture. By inference, we can learn about horrible things that happen in life and tragedy, like violent death, in a way that doesn't necessitate real violence and provides pleasure as well as education. This crucial conclusion is followed by his statement that there's also an instinct for harmony and rhythm. Some people have an inborn gift at this, and that long ago gave rise to poetry. In chapter 5, Aristotle's teleology becomes apparent. He isn't sure that tragedy has yet achieved its final perfected form, but he traces its origins and some stages of its development. Here he produces his famous notion of the temporal focus of tragedy on the actions that can take place in a single day. That has become known later as the unity of time. He says, tragedy attempts to take place within a single revolution of the sun, more or less, whereas epic is chronologically unbounded, and in this it differs. Yet, the first tragedies were done in the same way as epics. So it seems that the daytime compartment that the great tragic plots of Sophocles and Euripides used to such great effect was a development that came about as a result of the dramatist's experiments in actual practice. In chapter 6, Aristotle provides his formal definition of tragedy. It is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. It's in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament. It's in the form of action, not of narrative. And through pity and fear, it affects the proper catharsis of these emotions. Through pity and fear, it affects the proper catharsis of these emotions. Now, Aristotle is here countering Plato's objection to tragedy that it fed emotions like pity and fear, making the spectator less rational and less able to control emotions. Aristotle says that tragedy rightly produces these emotions in the spectator and also affects the catharsis of them. Now, Aristotelian tragic catharsis, although clearly signalling a useful transformation through an aesthetic experience, sadly must remain enigmatic, since the noun had many different metaphorical resonances. The Greek noun catharsis is related to the verb kathyrein, which means all the following: cleanse, purify, fumigate, purge, evacuate, wash off, prune a tree, winnow grain, clear land, refine gold. These physical processes can involve the washing or fumigation of cups and statues, or of wounds with a cleansing substance such as water or blood or incense. Pruning a tree meant removing parts of it, but it could also mean training the remaining branches of the plant by encouraging them to grow in a particular direction. Catharsis could indicate partial evacuation of naturally occurring substances, especially women's menstrual discharges. Aristotle uses the term with this signification over 50 times in his biological and zoological works. But catharsis could also mean selective elimination of undesirable elements within the same basic entity, so winnowing chaff from grain, removing weeds to allow nice plants to flourish in a field, refining ore to separate gold from base metal. Catharsis had begun, moreover, by the time of Aristotle, to bear a more metaphorical meaning. Plato speaks of men who were refined by philosophy, that's in the Phaedo, and Epicurus, the philosopher, who was about 40 years younger than Aristotle, called the intellectual clarification of a scientific problem a catharsis. In the Poetics, Aristotle doesn't offer a more specific account of what happens during catharsis, most frustratingly for us, nor in whom the process takes place. It's not even clear whether he's thinking about a collective process in which many people undergo catharsis together, like in an audience, or in an individual process taking place in a single atomized psyche. A preference for the single individual might be lent support from his statement later in the Poetics that the tragic effect doesn't even need a live theatrical performance to take place. He says the plot should be so constructed that even without seeing the play, anyone hearing of the incidents in it would actually thrill with fear and pity as a result of what occurs. So would anyone feel who heard the story of Oedipus. Now, in this chapter, after this brief mention of catharsis, Aristotle identifies the constituents of tragic theatre in their order of importance: plot, character, representation of people thinking, diction, music, and spectacle. The plot, praxis, arrangement of the incidents is by far the most important, he says. It's the soul of tragedy. And this is partly because the two most emotive elements, the peripetia or reversal and recognition scenes, belong to the element of plot. Chapters 7 to 14 contain the conceptual core of the treatise, and they further discuss plot. Chapter 7 says that tragedy needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and be of a certain length. Aristotle thinks that to get people feeling the emotions proper to tragedy, pity and fear, you need to work on them for a certain amount of time. This is different from comedy. People can be made to laugh in seconds. In chapter 8, he says that unity of plot doesn't come from it being about a single hero, but a single and complete action. And we all know the problems screenwriters have with making biopics with good plots. One incident in the life of a hero, he says, provides a much better plot structure. Chapter 9 introduces an important new concept. Poetry is closer to philosophy than it is to history, because it probes possibilities rather than actualities. This makes poetry superior to history. It is not, he says, the function of the poet to relate what has happened, but what may or might happen. What is possible according to the law of probability or necessity. The poet and the historian differ not because one writes in verse and one in prose. The true difference is that one relates what has happened, the other what may or might happen. Poetry, therefore, is a more philosophical and a higher thing than history. Poetry tends to express the universal and history, the particular. Plato would have had a very hard time answering this argument. If poetry does the same things as philosophy, then why should it be banned from the realm run by those philosopher kings? Chapter 10 introduces a distinction between simple and complex plots. Events in a plot are better if they're complex, are accompanied by reversal and recognition, and arise because of each other. One event should cause another, not simply precede it. In chapter 11, Aristotle clarifies what he means by reversal or peripetia. It's where the situation turns into its opposite. What seems to be a positive turns into a negative. The example Aristotle gives is the episode in the Oedipus of Sophocles, where the messenger from Corinth comes to tell Oedipus that his ostensible father, Polybus, is dead. But this news, of course, leads to the discovery of Oedipus's true identity in the anagnorisis and the reversal of his fortunes. This combination of peripetia and anagnorisis, especially if they are surprising, is very desirable for the tragic effect. There is a third element of plot, and that is actual representation of suffering, which does take up a large part of some tragedies, whether it's mental or physical pain. Chapter 12 gives labels to the different formal parts of tragedy. So prologue, episode, exode or final exit scene, choral songs including the entrance song, the parados, and the later ones, stasima, actors' songs, and duets with the chorus. But chapter 13 is the most significant of all. Aristotle advises that a perfect tragedy should have a complex plot which imitates actions exciting pity and fear. In order to get those emotions aroused, the central character needs to be of a specific moral type. And here Aristotle does seem to acknowledge that morality is a central dimension of tragedy. The change of fortune should be experienced not by a completely virtuous man falling into adversity, because that's just shocking, nor should it be a bad man rising to prosperity, because that's alien to the spirit of tragedy. It possesses no tragic quality, it doesn't satisfy the moral sense, and it doesn't call forth pity or fear. But nor should the downfall of the utter villain be exhibited. A plot of this kind would doubtless, he says, satisfy the moral sense, but it wouldn't inspire or pity or fear. Pity is aroused by unmerited misfortune, and fear by the misfortune of a man just like us. This leaves a man who's not outstandingly virtuous, but doesn't fall because of real wickedness or depravity. He falls through some hamartia. To make the fall most painful, he needs to be a man of high status like Oedipus and other mythical kings. Now, this advice about social status has affected the ways in which theatre developed, and not in a good way. It took until at least the 19th century for working class heroes and heroines to be the protagonists of tragic theatre. But the concept of a hamartia is crucial. It does not mean flaw. For many centuries it was mistranslated as character flaw and affected the way that Renaissance tragedy was written, giving central figures inherent and permanent character flaws, like sexual possessiveness in the case of Othello, or inability to take action in a timely way like Hamlet. But Aristotle doesn't mean that. His hero is of average morality, not evil, but not outstandingly good, and he makes a mistake. Hamartia is a word originally used in archery. It means shooting an arrow that doesn't even stick on the target. Like our English word mistake, it can mean make a mistake by doing something foolish, like Creon in Antigone foolishly ordering that Polynices shouldn't be buried. But it could also mean being mistaken, a mistake of fact. And a good example here is Oedipus simply not knowing Jocasta was his mother. Chapter 14 asks how best to evoke fear and pity, recommends the conflict should involve people who are really close, friends preferably of the same family. The poet can't alter the basic framework of myths, but he can make many choices about handling the material in terms of how consciously the deeds are done. So he thinks that the most powerful plots have the deeds done in complete ignorance of who the other person is, with the discovery made a long time afterwards on the day of the play. Chapter 15 moves on at last from plot to characterisation. Characters should be basically good, and here there is some more acknowledgement that at least one of Plato's points, the one about ethics, seemed to be offered. But different kinds of people are good in different ways. Their characters should fit their gender and social role. And here Aristotle infamously says that bravery in women is inappropriate. Characters should be realistic or true to life. They should also be consistent throughout the play. He doesn't approve of the sudden change in Iphigenia, in Euripides' Iphigenia and Aulis, who at first tries to persuade her father not to sacrifice her, but then rather suddenly changes her mind. Chapter 16 explores recognition, that's anagnorisis, further. Recognition can be of a person or events that have happened. It can be prompted by several different means. These can include scars and letters and tokens to having one's memory jogged, or inference, logical reasoning. Chapter 17 offers really sensible practical hints to the dramatist. He should use visualisation as he constructs the plot to make sure that there aren't any inconsistencies or improbabilities that will become apparent when you see it. He should prescribe gestures for the actors to imbue them with life. And he should start with the bare plot skeleton and then fill in the episodes with words and dialogue. In chapter 18, though, Aristotle returns to the plot. He says that every tragedy has a first part where everything's introduced and complicated. That's the desis. And the second part after the turning point, and that's the lusis, where everything is unravelled. And he divides plots into four basic types. They're complicated ones which use reversal and recognition, pathetic ones where strong emotion drives the plot, like Ajax's mad revenge in Sophocles' Ajax. The third is ethical, and most unfortunately the plays he cites here don't survive. They might be very important to understanding where Aristotle does make ethical criticism of tragedy. The fourth type is simple, like Aeschylus' Prometheus, in which very little actually happens, and spectacular tragedies set in Hades. He adds here that the chorus should have a share in the action, be organic, as in Sophocles rather than in Euripides. Chapter 19 addresses the representation of people thinking and deciding and diction. On thought, Aristotle cross-refers the reader to another treatise on a productive art, the Rhetoric. On diction, at least actual delivery of poetry, he says that this really doesn't come under the umbrella of poetry, implying that it's for actors and performers to analyse and advise on. Chapters 20 to 22 aren't particularly relevant to the defence of theatre. They contain interesting and detailed studies of the parts of speech used by poets, as well as by all of us when we speak, of sounds, sentence types, levels of diction, metaphors, and style. Although he approves of elevated language in moderation, he says the most important objective is clarity. He is, after all, a philosopher. Chapters 22 and 23 take epic poetry as their focus. He advises that epic should have a tight plot centred on a single action, as tragedy should, and that Homer's epics do this. And they do. They focus either on Odysseus' return or Achilles' wrath. Chapter 24 compares the metrical effects in tragedy and epic and praises Homer for using a lot of direct speech. Both genres should aim at making the action seem probable and rational. We looked much earlier at the first part of chapter 25, because it contains that crucial assertion about the autonomy of tragic art, its separation from other fields of knowledge. The final chapter, 26, asks, is epic or tragedy superior? And he says that some criticisms of tragedy are completely invalid, because they criticise not the essential plot-based features of the genre, but the performers. There are bad performers of epic, as well as bad performers of tragedy. Moreover, tragedy has all the same elements as epics, and its pleasures are further enhanced by music and spectacle. It's shorter, so its effect is much more concentrated. And here Aristotle asks what an epic on the plot of Sophocles' Oedipus would look like, and implies that it really would be very inferior to the tragedy. Tragedy also has more unity, he says, and it fulfills its own function, pity and fear and catharsis, more effectively. So in this final chapter, Aristotle effectively answers Socrates' proposal in the Republic that theatre is worse than epic. He's answered almost all of Plato's objections to theatre, at least tragic theatre, but some objections have been answered better than others. He's also spent a considerable portion of the treatise not in direct answer to Plato, but in developing his sophisticated and amazingly perceptive theory of the primacy and ideological structure of the praxis, the action represented, the plot. In conclusion, Aristotle's Poetics offers an extraordinary advance on the equipment available to the literary critic for analysing and evaluating poetry, especially tragic poetry, and especially the element of praxis, plot. Aristotle provides important new terms for us to think with about tragedy, besides the identification of its constituent and formal components. These are catharsis, hamartia, peripetia, agnoresis, desis and lysis, and temporal scope. But how successfully does he defend tragic theatre against his teacher's criticisms? First, mimesis. He denies that mimesis is harmful because he does not believe that there's a world of immaterial forms. He says mimesis is natural and it's beneficial to humans because we learn from it and do so with pleasure. It helps us understand horrible things that we can't contemplate in reality without distress. He answers Plato's objection that imitative arts contain false or inadequate knowledge of non-poetic matters by saying that the poeticae techne, the poetic art, is a separate, autonomous and productive branch of knowledge with its own immanent qualities, and that making a successful poem is possible even if it's factually inaccurate. He identifies the quality of ekplexis, or strikingness or impact, as something at which poetry should aim. He implicitly refutes Plato's objections that our senses are fallible by using them to describe theatrical phenomena with precision and in detail. He also addresses the problem of mimesis from an indirect angle when he states that poetry has more to do with what might happen than what did happen. A mimesis of what might happen is more like philosophy than history. The inference could be drawn that since tragedy doesn't claim to represent anything truthful, it doesn't make that claim, it can't be criticised on the ground that it's a mere imitation. A final point relating to mimesis is that Aristotle praises tragedy's immediacy and vitality as consisting of speech entirely in the acted personae rather than containing narrative. Plato had said epic was less bad for you than tragedy on precisely this ground, but Aristotle turns the argument on its head as proving the superiority of tragedy. Aristotle doesn't, however, articulate any really serious response to Plato's objection that the gods shouldn't be represented as immoral or changeable. Aristotle just wouldn't have agreed with Plato's idea of divinity. He thought that God existed but was remote from human life, a form of perfect cosmic mind or intellect, but not involved in supervising human morality or punishing human miscreants. Aristotle probably didn't believe in the old myths any more than Plato did. But he treated them with some respect. In fact, he regarded them as ways in which people in the olden days tried to explain cosmic matters before the invention of natural science and philosophy. In chapter 25, he does make one interesting statement about the old stories and myths. He says they're very possibly what the earlier philosopher Xenophanes had said they were, that is, inventions of humans in their own image, imbued with all the failings with which men reproach each other. But Aristotle says that if someone criticises a poet for using the old stories, which aren't factually true, the answer is simply this. This is what people say. This is what is said. It's a story, no more nor less, and acknowledging or making poetry on its themes does not imply belief in their actuality. It must be said, however, that Aristotle's human-centred account of tragedy does almost completely ignore its gods, its theological aspect, and its religion. Oedipus is explained entirely by Aristotle through human action and thought. Apollo is nowhere mentioned. The same applies to almost the entire treatise, except for a few words on the use of the theatrical machine, which should arise, he says, organically from the plot, rather than just be stuck on as an afterthought, as in Medea. Now, Aristotle's neglect of the gods actually has had a benefit in the subsequent history of tragedy, in that theology tended to be downplayed in plays from the Renaissance onwards, making tragedy accessible to people of many different religions, or none at all. But it's in the theological sphere that Aristotle, I think, is least adequate in his refutation of Plato. It seems that their different philosophical outlooks, with Aristotle so doggedly focused on human experience, made it quite impossible for Plato and Aristotle to hold a constructive dialogue about the gods in tragedy at all. However, when it comes to Plato's objection that tragedy fed its participants' emotions and weakened and emasculated them, Aristotle's belief that emotions weren't inherently bad is a knockout argument. This he enhanced with the idea that working up emotions in a mimesis could actually produce their beneficial catharsis, whatever that may actually mean. On tragic morality, Aristotle arrived at a compromise. Although he states that the poetic art has nothing to do with the political art, which is a part of ethics, there are comments on the morals of tragic characters scattered throughout his treatise. and he does seem to have thought it was an important question. In chapter 25, he says we can make comments from the ethical sphere when assessing whether something has been done correctly, poetically speaking. We can use ethics to judge poetic worth. We can discuss whether a good poetic effect has been achieved by the choice of speaker or agent, and whether it's done in a way that would secure a greater good or avert a greater evil. And this moral assessment, he says, is a legitimate part of literary criticism, but it's subordinate to the art of poetry rather than the other way round. He does think that the protagonists of tragedy mustn't be bad men, but the argument isn't that people would automatically imitate them in real life, like Plato. It's because their changing fortunes wouldn't elicit fear and pity in us. We've got to identify with them. He also thinks that unnecessary badness, even of minor characters, is to be avoided if it's not necessitated by the plot. And here he gives the example of the truly loathsome Menelaus of Euripides, Orestes, an ambitious, self-seeking and corrupt individual, incapable of sympathy or loyalty to friends and family. But lastly, Aristotle doesn't address directly Plato's suggestion that the whole city-state needs to exclude the poets because poetry makes members of the city-state weak and emotional. Aristotle has divorced the art of poetry from the art of ethics and politics. He's not interested at all in the relationship between tragic theatre and the polis in general, let alone Athens, where tragedy was invented and where its canonical works were first performed. He creates a theory of tragedy fit for a genre that was rapidly becoming internationalised and performed in cities across Alexander's new empire, few of which resembled Athens in constitution. But unlike Plato, Aristotle had faith in ordinary spectators' ability to learn profitably and with pleasure from tragedy about things that were beneficial or useful to them, and by implication to their wider communities. Aristotle loved theatre. He included discussions of real-life actors, not only in Poetics, but in his Nicomachean Ethics, his Eudemian Ethics, and his Rhetoric. He'd seen live performances, probably very many, during his 2 extended periods of residence in Athens, first between 367 and 347, and again after 335. His experience of theatre and familiarity with dramatic texts informed his entire philosophical project. His lost works include a book on tragedies, perhaps the published treatise dealing with visual effects that he mentions in Poetics, and 2 of his other lost treatises reflected his project of creating a comprehensive chronological record of the results of the drama competitions at Athens. And that book was called Victories at the Dionysia, and another one, the Didascalii. Unlike his teacher Plato, Aristotle thoroughly respected theatre, regarded it as useful in the education of citizens and the life of the flourishing city-state. Aristotle's great human-centred secular ethics are fundamentally informed by the theatrical culture of Athens. Thank you very much.